Thank you, Dr. Rajkumar. Thank you, Dr. Acharya. I'm a little overwhelmed. Not overwhelmed by being here, but having listened to the Vice Chancellor tell us about how he conceived of this school. That in itself is a story that I think he should write as part of an opening chapter of a book, that how he thinks of higher education in India. So I am still thinking about everything that he said, and I'm trying to make sense of how this all come together. This beautiful building in a very pretty part of the state, and what we have heard in the last hour about the programs of this university, this research program, the faculty program, this is just overwhelming. I can say that I haven't heard of this from any other university in India having such an interesting trajectory, and I can only hope that you will continue and grow from strength to strength, and if there is anything we can contribute from American University, we'll be honored to do so. About the topic today, I'm afraid that I'm going to disappoint you because I came here with some talking points rather than a paper. In academics, I always have a paper somewhere in the background. And I wanted to talk like a politician rather than as an academic. What the politicians do, as opposed to academics, is that they have a stump speech. So if a candidate for the US president goes to different states, he just basically gives the same speech with some variations, depending on whether one is in Texas or in Wisconsin or California. So being a professor of global governance, I have a stump speech. So I just go and tell about the key points. I hit the key buttons and expect people to ask questions. And therefore, I have a stump speech on what I think of global governance, and I will just present to you in a very simplified form, rather than in a theoretically sophisticated form. But I'll be very happy to talk about theories and concepts later on. This is because I have an obligation as this professor of transnational challenges and governance. My mandate is to promote the study and debate about global governance. It's not just about study, but also the debate. And what I'm going to talk about is the debate rather than the study part. And a lot of that has actual policy implications about how global governance is conceived and presented and being implemented around the world. So there has been a lot of talk about global governance. It's an idea which is not very old when it comes to academia, but it's rather new when it comes to the policy community. In fact, it will be pretty hard to think of the policy community, the governments of the world, talking about global governance in any serious, meaningful way before the 2008 global financial crisis. And it was after that crisis that the so-called, what Sam Huntington called the Davos men, he didn't call Davos women, Davos men, they took over this concept of global governance and suddenly realized that capitalism as an economic system and with its all political ramifications cannot be ungoverned. So we have to do something about it. So the discourse of global governance started there was basically had very little to do with the academic debate on global governance, which long predated the policy debate. And this disjuncture has very interesting implications, how the academics who study global governance see this, especially before the 2008 crisis, and how the policymakers, the Davos men, think of the global governance concept after 2008 are quite different. And this is where I will level some arguments and critiques of the Davos concept of global governance and try to put forward an alternative which, as my dean and I were driving from New Delhi to here, we thought about a concept, what sounds good with a D. And we thought we should call it the Dalit, but not men, but women concept of global governance, as opposed to the Davos men concept of global governance. And let me tell you why, and why I think and where I think the debate is problematic, if not the debate, the discourse of global governance that started after 2008. And at the very end, I'll try to answer the question whether it's a myth or a reality. I think you have to wait for my answer to that question. Now, I have been involved in the academic study of global governance from a very different vantage point. I actually like regionalism more than globalism. Those of you who have read my work will know that I'm actually a scholar of comparative Asian and comparative regionalism. A lot of my work is on that. I believe that global governance can only start from a local or a regional basis. But since 2008, there's been such a proliferation of conferences, debates, seminars, that I had no choice but to participate. I was sucked into it. If you are a scholar sitting in Washington, even in Bristol, before I went to Washington, I was chair of global governance there. There was no escape from this assault on your time and attention from those who wanted to promote this idea of global governance in the policy circle, funded a lot of universities, a lot of conferences, and promoted a particular view of global governance. And when I sat through these conferences, whether it's Princeton, in Oxford, in Singapore, and we even organized a conference in global governance, thanks to Dean Goodman, who gave us a bunch of money to launch our beautiful new building, which I invite you to visit, both in person but also in the web. When we launched that building, after Barack Obama gave the first speech in the building, we had a conference in global governance immediately following that. So we have all done this. But the level of discomfort I found in this narrative, this concept of global governance, has to do with four things. And let me tell you this, what these four things are. First of all, despite the sort of academic debate that had preceded the 2008 crisis, and the conscious attempt by scholars to define this in the broadest possible terms, the 2008 and post-2008 concept of global governance has revolved around a particular notion of power and hegemony. It's actually a concept that is very much associated with this idea of emerging powers, the G20. So the starting assumption of this is that the global power structure is shifting, so there is a power shift, and in view of the power shift, including the rise of countries like China, India, Brazil, the BRICS, global governance needs to change, or the governance architecture of the world needs to change. And the debate about global governance became very closely associated with the G20 and what I call the power south, the emerging powers of the world. There's nothing inherently wrong about it, but it sort of lost some of its broader, more open connotations that the concept had acquired. So global governance is, very simple terms, the way I look at it, is governance without government. And a bunch of scholars who have worked on this concept have tried to define it in a very broad possible terms, because they were trying to move away from intergovernmental relationships, which is basically what international organization studies is about. They wanted to bring in all sorts of actors, civil society, about transnational groups, transnational challenges onto the rubric. But after 2008, a lot of this was about the new multilateralism, the G20, reform of the UN Security Council, and reform of the global financial architecture, very big issue. And that sort of created a kind of an air of power politics around this concept, which this concept was meant to challenge in the first place. So, for example, look at this G20 phenomenon, the group of 20, and the emerging powers. Now, the whole idea of emerging powers is closely linked to the concept of a BRIC, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And who invented the concept? The concept was invented by Goldman Sachs. And who is Goldman Sachs? Well, I don't have to tell you that. So this was basically to create a niche phrase to basically help the investors to make money out of these markets. And in that process, it invented a concept that then took a life of its own and then fed into this debate about the G20, group of 20, which brought together some of the most powerful and emerging nations of the so-called developing world. But looking at the G20's origins and its role, of course, in many ways, it's very important, very consequential. I think it should take some credit for managing the global financial crisis of 2008 through a variety of reforms. So in some people's words, it has become the premier institution for global economic policymaking, even more important than the established institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or the WTO and the like. But who are the members of the G20? Well, most of them are Europeans. And the origins of the G20 has to do with not any sort of democratic selection process or really any very thoughtful selection process. It was basically the US Treasury and the German Bundesbank decided who to invite to the first G20 meeting after the 10 years before the 2008 crisis. And it was an institution that was evolving and came into life after the 2008 crisis. So it was founded in a very undemocratic way. That's the message I was trying to give. That doesn't make it necessarily sort of unimportant. And you can see that it's good to have countries like India, countries like China, which are rising or who are making a bigger contribution to the global growth, to have more responsibility, more stakes and more responsibility for global governance. But it is also important to note countries that have been left out of this process. And for example, Africa is represented by only one country, South Africa. In Asia, we have a fairly good representation. I think Asia has probably one of the best representations, but Europe is overrepresented. So in many ways, this idea of global governance is an extension of the old concept of global governance plus some new actors. And this leads to the second point, which is basically what sort of impact this idea, this G20 is having on North-South relations. Now, those of you who know history will know that we had a kind of a North-South divide in the global economy and global politics since the end of colonialism and the beginning of the Cold War. And of course, the end of the Cold War had a political impact in bridging some of the, ending some of the ideological forces, factors behind this divide. So G20 is a very promising development because it brings together countries of the North and the countries of the South together to solve the problems of the world. So that should be actually very encouraging, end of the North-South divide. But does the G20 really represent the South? And does the G20 actually, and who represents or who leads the G20? Is there a consensus among the countries of the South, countries of the developing world that are represented in the G20 about what to do about global governance? I think the one point they all agree on is that they should have more power, they should have more say, they should have more authority, but over global governance, over international institutions like IMF, World Bank. But beyond that, how to manage issues like climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, even global financial architecture, not to mention things like human rights and democracy. It's pretty hard to see what they have a consensus. I mean, a simple example would be the positions of China and India on UN Security Council reform. China simply doesn't want India to have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. China doesn't want Japan to have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. The Europeans will not give up their 2 seats of the French and the British in the Security Council, the permanent seats, in exchange for a European Union's corporate or collective representation. So in that sense, we see that the G20, at least the south part of G20 is not very united in its objectives. And I can go on about various issues, climate change, non-proliferation. There are significant differences within this. This is not a very homogeneous group, either in terms of GDP, level of growth. Even within BRICS, you will see major differences in terms of population, size, GDP, per capita at least, among the BRIC countries. Beyond that, the impact it is probably having on the G20 is having on North-South relations is creating 2 kinds of South. It's polarizing the South between what I call the power South and the poor South. So there are a lot of poor countries, people who are sort of supposed to benefit from the Millennium Development Goals. I don't think their voice is being heard in Davos or other places. I don't know, have you ever heard of the president of Fiji speak at Davos, or the president of Mali talking at Davos? No, it's a small bunch of countries that go there, the leaders go there, make their voice heard, and hobnob with the elite of the world. So I'm wondering whether this creates a new form of not North-South division, but South-South division between the power and the poor South. So countries like the power South, India and China, often represents itself as a member of the South, the developing world. South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, they are, of course, moving up in the power of at least the status ladder, and maybe countries like Bangladesh and countries like even Egypt, the largest country and the most influential country in the Arab world, doesn't have a seat on those councils. The other thing that is happening is between regional aspirations and the global governance leadership. There is a kind of a disjuncture between the regional and the sort of global levels of this global new emerging or the dominant discourse on global governance. For example, if you look at the G20 countries or the emerging powers, many of them, not all of them, many of them aspire to global leadership but do not have regional legitimacy. They're not liked by their own region. They have very problematic relations with the region. And Asia is a classic example. And we can start from India. India doesn't have the legitimacy to represent South Asia. China, despite some good work in the 2000s, is increasingly isolated in its own region, in its own neighborhood. Japan always had a problem in East Asia because it refuses to properly apologize for its wartime behavior. So I've written an article in International Affairs, Can Asia Lead? This was published in 2010, and my argument was that neither India nor China nor Japan are doing very much, collectively at least, but individually as well, to really take the lead in global governance as they should as the emerging powers of the world. What they're doing instead is increasing their national power and pursuing the national power aspirations. So India is moving away from the Nehruvian to the Karjanian foreign policy, as Rajmohan would put it. China is trying to have its peaceful rights, which is another way of saying that it wants to be a hegemon without being contested. Japan is trying to become a normal state, moving in some ways away from its peacetime constitution. These are examples of what I call national power aspirations. These are not contributions to global governance. When it comes to Security Council reform, they don't speak in some buzz. Maybe India and Japan do, but China always puts a spanner on this. But what would be better, and none of these countries have capacity to lead Asian regional institutions. Who is leading the Asian regional institutions? It's ASEAN, a group of weak and smaller countries, but which have a lot more legitimacy. And why ASEAN is leading? It's partly by default, partly by reputation. ASEAN has been around for more than 45 years. It has been quite successful in managing conflict. But if not ASEAN, who? Neither India nor China nor Japan will be acceptable as the leaders of Asia by their own countries, by their own neighbors. So my point here is that lack of regional legitimacy can tie you down and make it very difficult to aspire for global governance. The situation may be a little different in Africa and Latin America. I was in South Africa last year, and I'll be visiting it shortly. South Africans claim to represent Africa in G20. They think we are the African voice. But not many African countries agree with that. So even if they make a point of consulting the African Union, but really, it's pretty hard to think of South Africa representing West Africa or Egypt and there's no Arab, Egypt is not a member of the G20. Latin America, Brazil, I know my dean would know much more about it. My sense is that Brazilians have done much better in relating to their own neighbors, thanks to their own regional grouping called Mercosur. But even then, can we say that it represents the neighborhood completely? So question of representation and legitimacy becomes an issue when you aspire to global governance without regional legitimation. And this is a point I've been trying to make everywhere that I go to, whether it's in conferences in Abu Dhabi, Princeton, or in England, in my conference in American University, it sort of doesn't resonate with people. Because this global governance debate has been hijacked by a bunch of people who religiously follow the G20, including some of my Canadian friends at the University of Toronto, the Munk Center. They cannot take any criticism of G20 like this. So this is one of the problems. I'll give you another example. Indonesia. Indonesia has been a really exemplary country when it comes to dealing with its neighbors. In 1967, Indonesia was one of the countries that founded ASEAN, Association for Southeast Asian Nations. And as part of this institution building, Indonesia, which is the largest, most powerful country in terms of population resources in Southeast Asia, not in terms of military power, but the largest and most populous country, it actually undertook a commitment to show restraint towards neighbors. So under President Sukarno, Indonesia invaded Malaysia. It did not recognize the legitimacy of the Malaysian state. So it invaded Malaysia, it attacked Singapore. And when Sukarno was replaced by Suharto, Suharto is a dictator, but he had at least one enlightened vision that is to exercise restraint towards its neighbors. So Indonesia put itself in a kind of a golden cage. So Indonesia said basically we would not threaten our neighbors, and in return the neighbors respected Indonesia as the regional elder, not as the regional hegemon, but as the regional sort of first among equals in some way. And ASEAN has thrived on that bargain since 1967. This bargain has never existed in South Asia. This bargain has never existed in the case of East Asia, in the case of China today. In South Africa, it's a little better than during the apartheid regime, but during the apartheid regime, South Africa, the largest, most powerful country in Southern Africa, was the biggest threat to all its smaller neighbors. So what is happening today? After Indonesia got the invitation to G20, it started talking about leapfrogging ASEAN. It talked about a post-ASEAN foreign policy. So we are too big for ASEAN. This is a bunch of our neighbors. They sometimes hold us back. So we are been a member of G20. We will be part of a concert of powers in Asia. So we will have now with the Americans, the Japanese, the Indians, and the South Koreans, and the Chinese, rather than with Philippines or Thailand or East Timor or Brunei. Now, luckily, that tendency has been held under check, but there is a significant tendency today in the part of Indonesia not to threaten its neighborhood, but just ignore it and move on to the global level. Now, you can talk about this same thing for India and China, how much effort India is putting into SAARC as opposed to, say, the G20 and its aspiration to be a global player. China, of course, is kind of some people, at least some elites of China, think so much of their own rising status or aspiration to be number one that they forgot that they have a region to live with. So last year, since 2010, they have been bullying their neighbors in the South China Sea and lost a lot of so-called soft power, or indeed a lot of the charm offensive they had launched in the 2000s. So I think the biggest problem, one of the biggest problems or challenges to global governance is that the countries which are emerging from the South and aspiring to be part of the global governors community, global governance leaders, they are not taking the region with them. They're leaving the region behind them. And that's really a big problem because global governance can only start. Just imagine if India, China, and Japan got together and first focused on cooperating in the region, managing the problem of Asia. And Asia is a microcosm of a lot of the problems that happens in the world, whether it's climate change, energy security, pandemics, natural disasters. A lot of the transnational challenges actually originate or actually have something to do with Asia. The 1997 financial crisis started in Asia. So if they could actually join their hands and manage the problems of Asia, not only the Asians will respect them, they will learn lessons and try to earn respect at the global community, but they're not doing it. And finally, the final sort of discomfort I have about the contemporary sort of dominant discourse on global governance is about ideas and norms. I pay close attention to the international politics of ideas and norms, and I find that here there's a big problem between the old norms of international relations and the emerging norms of global governance. Now, what are the old norms of international relations? There will be like respect for sovereignty, non-intervention being a leading sort of a principle. And non-intervention means not allowing another country to interfere in our domestic affairs, which means even making sure that a government can do whatever it wants to do within its territory. Now, that was changing thanks to norms like humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect, concepts of transnational justice, and of course, common but differentiated responsibility in climate change, protection of human rights and promotion of democracy. But many of these emerging powers are becoming norm wreckers rather than norm makers. Their main policy in the councils of global governance has been to stick to the older norms and rather than actually champion the new norms. China is one of the biggest defenders of Westphalian sovereignty today. No matter what they say, that they make some concessions, they allowed the French and the British to intervene in Libya, but generally they are, along with Russia, and India is also not a big champion of humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect either. So they are sticking back to the old norms and creating complications for norms of transnational justice, humanitarian intervention, and this becomes really problematic when we talk about a new concept, an emancipatory concept of global governance. So if you add this all together, and I should conclude very shortly so that we can have a question and answer, I'm not very enamored by the concept of global governance, especially the post-2008 concept. Now, before 2008, there is an academic literature which still is pursued by some academics, which is much more emancipatory, much more open. And this basically talks about global governance as a governance without government, which by definition brings in the civil society into play. It brings into new norms of transnational justice, transitional justice, transnational cooperation, human rights and democracy into play. It's not led by the Davos men. It's also bottom-up. It talks about local construction of global order. It talks about synergy between regional and global institutions. Now, those conceptions of global governance have been silenced, marginalized somewhat, unless you talk about things happening on the ground. So for the Davos men, there is, of course, Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy Wall Street is probably the other extreme because it's a very practical and hands-on rejection of not only globalization, but the concept of global governance that is embedded within that concept of globalization. So I would propose that the concept of global governance that I would be comfortable with, and many other people that I know would be comfortable with, will be something that is bottom-up, inclusive of civil society. It's inclusive. It accepts diversity rather than imposes like a Washington consensus or one form of ideology over others. It's not enamored. It's not tied to the BRICS or the G20. I actually have a term called BRICS versus the best. The best countries, I call them Bangladesh, Egypt, Singapore, and Thailand, but you can find T for a lot of countries. I mean, Bangladesh pioneered microfinance. Why isn't it given a seat in the councils of global governance? Singapore has been a pioneer of free trade and many good ideas of open regionalism. It doesn't have a place in G20. Egypt, for better or for worse, actually was a defender of stability in relations with Israel. And why isn't this having a seat in the councils of power? It's totally marginalized, and especially after the Arab Spring. So I think we should look for quality and contribution where we can find it, and not to institutionalize it in a very exclusionary way as it is happening in the G20. Despite all the good things G20 have done, it's really a very parochial representation of global governance. And I also think that global governance should be based on dynamic pluralism. That means it's accept change. Basically, what I see about global governance is just, hang on to the old order and bring in a few countries who actually accept that order. So yes, you can make a Chinese the vice president of the World Bank, or Indian, give a big position. But basically, the system remains what it was since there is no fundamental bargaining to restructure the system. In fact, people like John Eikenberry, whose work you know, is basically saying that the liberal international order is not disappearing. The liberal international order that Americans created, the United States created after the Second World War, is not disappearing despite the decline of US, because countries like China and rest of the emerging powers are simply buying into it. Why? Because they thrived under that liberal international order. China is where it is today by embracing capitalism, by joining the WTO, by trading with the United States. So China has no incentive to fundamentally wreck the system of global governance that the US created, even though the US is declining relative to China. Now, that sort of logic, whether you accept, I mean, I don't accept it, but that means the emergence of the new centers of power is basically what my former colleague at York University would say, problem solving, not critical approaches to global governance. And at the same time, we have a number of issues and actors which risk being marginalized in this whole discourse about global governance. So to answer the question that was posed to me, whether global governance is a myth or a reality, it is not a myth, it is a reality. But the real question is not whether it's what kind of a reality is it? It's a reality that is pretty much an extension of the reality of the past. It's not the system of global governance that is emerging through the dominant discourses, through Davos and other forums, is basically a tinkering, a marginal tinkering of the system that is in the past. It's creating power south to engage with the rich north countries. It's leaving the poor south behind. And at the same time, it is not advancing the normative change that, in fact, maybe holding back the normative change, process of normative change we have seen before the 2008 crisis. And it's also not taking seriously the regional and the local dimensions, the basis of global governance. So even if it's a reality that we should not accept. Reality I would not recommend us to accept, and would rather strive for an ideal of global governance, which is at the moment a bit of a myth. That is the idea of a bottom-up pluralistic concept of global governance, which is still some time away for us to achieve. Thank you very much.